There is a question that serious economists have been arguing about for at least 60 years, and there is still no consensus answer. The question is not whether reserve currencies collapse. That is settled. They all do. Every single one that has ever existed, the Roman denarius, the Byzantine solidus, the Venetian ducat, the Spanish piece of 8, the Dutch guilder, the British pound sterling, each one, at its peak, was held by foreign governments as the foundation of their financial reserves. And each one, in the end, lost that status. Each one was used to price international commodities, settle trade disputes, and denominate sovereign debt across dozens of nations. The question that economists still argue about is whether the signs are visible before it happens, whether anyone can see it coming, or whether, as many believe, the collapse always arrives as a shock, a sudden loss of confidence, a cascade of selling, a moment when the world collectively decided the emperor had no clothes. The forensic record says something more specific than either of those positions. The collapses were not invisible. They were not sudden. In every documented case, 4 specific warning signs appeared before the final break, sometimes decades before. The problem was not that the signs were hidden. The problem was that the people who saw them chose not to act on what they revealed. This video is about those 4 signs. We are going to go through each one using the primary historical record, not the mythology around these events, the actual documented pattern. And at the end, I will tell you what the forensic evidence says about where we sit right now. Warning sign 1. The currency issuer spends more than its economy can sustain. This is the oldest sign. It appears in every single case without exception. It begins the same way every time. The nation that controls the reserve currency gains something economists have called the exorbitant privilege. Because the world needs the currency for trade, foreign governments and central banks hold it in large quantities. This means the reserve currency issuer can borrow at lower interest rates than anyone else. It can run trade deficits without the usual consequences. It can finance wars, social programs, and military installations around the world without immediately triggering inflation at home. The bills get exported to the rest of the world, who absorb them because they need the currency anyway. This is not sustainable. But it takes a long time before the mathematics become visible. Let us start with Rome. The Roman denarius was introduced in 211 BC as a silver coin with a purity of approximately 95%. For the first 2 centuries of its existence, a Roman soldier could trust that the coin he was paid with contained what the coin claimed to contain. That trust was the foundation of Rome's commercial dominance across the Mediterranean world. Merchants in North Africa, Gaul, Britain, and the Levant accepted denarii because they knew the metal content matched the face value. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero faced a fiscal crisis. The Great Fire of Rome had destroyed 2/3 of the city. He was simultaneously funding the Roman-Parthian War and rebuilding the capital to his specifications, which included a palace so large that the satirist Martial later wrote that all of Rome was swallowed up by one man's house. Nero needed more money than the treasury contained. His answer was to reduce the silver content of the denarius from 95% to approximately 90% and reduce its weight from 4 cad, 5 grams, to 3-4 grams. From the same amount of silver, you could now mint more coins. This was the ancient equivalent of printing money. The first debasement was small enough that ordinary Romans could not detect it with the naked eye. Trade continued. But a precedent had been set that every subsequent emperor who faced a fiscal shortfall would follow. Nero's successor, Vespasian, reduced the silver content further. Domitian restored it briefly. Trajan reduced it again. By 200 AD, under Septimius Severus, the denarius was 46% silver. By 268 AD, under Gallienus, it was approximately 2% silver. The coin that had once been 95% pure metal was now essentially a bronze token with a silver wash applied to its surface to maintain the appearance of value. What Nero had done in 64 AD, in an attempt to paper over a short-term fiscal crisis, was set in motion a process that required 200 years to fully destroy what he began destroying. The debasement was not a single catastrophic decision. It was a series of small decisions, each made by an emperor who believed he was managing a temporary problem, each slightly worse than the last. The Roman case is the clearest documentation of warning sign 1, but it repeats in every subsequent collapse. Britain's position as the reserve currency issuer of the 19th and early 20th centuries rested on a different kind of discipline, the gold standard. But the discipline broke down during the same kind of fiscal crisis. Britain entered World War I as the world's largest creditor nation. It exited the war as a debtor. To finance the conflict, the British government borrowed extensively from Commonwealth members and, most significantly, from the United States. By 1945, Britain owed roughly £14 billion to foreign creditors, while its entire foreign currency reserve in 1956 was equivalent to just $2 billion. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1945 left the United States holding $3.75 billion in British debt, an amount that exceeded Britain's entire reserve base. When the Suez Crisis arrived in 1956 and Britain attempted to assert military force over Egypt's nationalization of the canal, the United States did not need to fire a single weapon to stop it. It simply threatened to sell its holdings of British pound sterling bonds on the open market. In 1 week in November 1956, Britain's gold and dollar reserves fell by $102 million. The government could not sustain that rate of loss. Harold Macmillan, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time and would become Prime Minister within months, understood that Britain had reached the mathematical limit of what its reserve position could support. The troops withdrew. The canal stayed nationalized. The pound never recovered its pre-Suez credibility. The United States moved toward the same warning signs starting in the 1960s. Under the Bretton Woods system established in 1944, the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Foreign central banks held dollars, which they could exchange for gold at that fixed rate. The system worked as long as the United States held enough gold to back the dollars in circulation. But financing the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, and maintaining hundreds of military installations worldwide required the United States to export dollars at a rate that outpaced its gold reserves. By 1959, the economist Robert Triffin had already identified the structural contradiction in formal testimony before the United States Congress. He explained, in terms that were completely clear at the time, that the United States faced an insurmountable dilemma. To supply the world with dollar liquidity, it had to run balance of payments deficits. But those deficits, over time, would mean the U.S. owed more gold than it possessed. He called it the point at which the system would face a confidence crisis. He predicted the crisis to within a decade. By 1971, the claims on U.S. gold reserves held by foreign central banks exceeded the actual gold supply several times over. France had already been converting dollar holdings to gold systematically. West Germany left the Bretton Woods system in May 1971, unwilling to continue absorbing dollars. On August 11th, Britain requested $3 billion in gold from the United States. On August 13th, Nixon met with his advisors at Camp David. On August 15, he closed the gold window entirely. The pattern across all three cases is identical. The reserve currency issuer accumulates obligations that exceed its resource base, and it uses the privilege of issuing the reserve currency to delay the reckoning. The delay makes the final adjustment more severe. Warning sign 2. Foreign holders begin quietly reducing their exposure. The second warning sign does not appear in newspaper headlines. It appears in the accounting records of foreign central banks, and it almost always precedes the public crisis by years. When confidence in a reserve currency begins to erode, the first actors to respond are not small investors or ordinary citizens. They are institutional holders, foreign central banks and finance ministries that have both the information to recognize what is happening and the fiduciary responsibility to protect their reserve position. They do not announce what they are doing. They move quietly, because announcement would accelerate exactly the crisis they are trying to avoid before they have finished repositioning. In the late 1920s, the Bank of France began systematically converting its sterling reserves to gold. Governor Émile Moreau, in a letter to the French Minister of Finance in October 1929, acknowledged explicitly that the conversion of sterling holdings was aimed, in part, at weakening London's financial position. France was not doing this because of personal animus toward Britain. It was doing it because French monetary authorities had concluded that the pound's position was structurally weaker than its official parity suggested. They moved first. They moved quietly. and the sterling crisis that followed, culminating in Britain's departure from the gold standard in September 1931, came as a shock to the British public, but not to the Bank of France, which had largely completed its repositioning before the crisis hit. The pattern repeated with the dollar. Charles de Gaulle, who understood both the political and financial dimensions of American power, made French gold conversion policy explicit and public in 1965. At a press conference in Paris, de Gaulle stated that France intended to convert its dollar reserves to gold at the official rate, and he argued that the dollar's reserve status represented an exorbitant privilege that allowed the United States to export its inflation to the rest of the world. The speech was widely reported and widely dismissed as political theater. But de Gaulle was not making a political speech. He was describing what France's central bank was already doing. Between 1965 and 1971, France shipped gold repatriation vessels to the United States to collect French gold deposits from the Federal Reserve. When Nixon closed the gold window in August 1971, the move was not prompted by a theoretical argument about international monetary systems. It was prompted by a specific request from Britain for $3 billion in gold that the United States could not fulfill without triggering the crisis it was trying to prevent. The British request was itself preceded by weeks of gold flows out of American reserves as European central banks accelerated their conversions. The forensic record is precise on this point. The foreign holders who acted first preserved their position. The holders who acted last lost the most. Today, the equivalent signal is visible in two places. The first is the share of global foreign exchange reserves held in US dollars. According to IMF SOFR data, that share stood at 71% in 1999. By the fourth quarter of 2024, it had declined to approximately 57%, the lowest level since 1994. The decline has been gradual and steady. No single country is dumping dollars, but the collective direction of movement has been consistent for a quarter century. The second signal is central bank gold purchases. In 2022, 2023, and 2024, global central banks purchased more than 1,000 metric tons of gold per year, 3 consecutive years at that pace, which had not occurred since the gold standard era. In 2025, purchases totaled 863 tons, still nearly double the annual average of the prior decade. The buying is not confined to obvious candidates. Poland, India, Brazil, and Turkey have all been active buyers alongside China and Russia. In a 2025 World Gold Council survey, 73% of global central bankers stated their belief that the US dollar's share of global reserves would decrease over the following 5 years. 95% expected total gold reserves to increase. Central banks do not make these statements casually. They make them after their economists have run the numbers. Warning sign 3. The issuer weaponizes the currency, and the world notices. The third warning sign is the one that accelerates the timeline. It is the moment when the reserve currency issuer uses its monetary power as a foreign policy weapon against a specific group of countries, and those countries draw the logical conclusion about what the currency is worth to them. Reserve currency status depends on the perception that the currency is neutral, that any nation can hold it, use it, and convert it without political interference. The moment that perception is credibly challenged, every holder of the currency has to assess whether they might someday be on the receiving end of the same treatment. In the Suez Crisis of 1956, the United States used 3 specific financial weapons against Britain to force withdrawal from Egypt. It blocked the International Monetary Fund from providing Britain with $561 million in standby credit. It blocked the U.S. Export-Import Bank from extending $600 million in additional credit, and it threatened to sell American holdings of pound sterling bonds on the open market unless Britain complied. This was financial warfare conducted by the world's dominant power against one of its closest allies. Britain's government, facing reserve losses of over $200 million in a single month, capitulated within weeks. The episode did not immediately destroy confidence in sterling, but it demonstrated to every holder of sterling reserves what sterling was worth in a crisis where British and American interests diverged. The countries that began quietly reducing their sterling holdings after 1956 were drawing a rational conclusion from documented evidence. The dollar version of this warning sign arrived in February 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan coordinated the most extensive financial sanctions ever imposed on a major economy. They froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves that were held in Western financial institutions. Russia lost access overnight to reserves it had spent years accumulating in dollars, euros, and pounds. The assets did not disappear. They were frozen. Russia could not use them. This was the first time since World War II that the G7 had weaponized reserve assets belonging to a major economy's central bank, and every country that holds dollar reserves, whether allied with Russia or not, now knows it is theoretically possible for those reserves to be frozen if relations with the United States deteriorate sufficiently. The response has been documented in trade data, not in political speeches. In the 2 years following the Russian sanctions, the RMB's share of global trade finance doubled. Russia-China bilateral trade conducted in rubles and yuan exceeded 90% by 2024. Saudi Arabia, which had maintained the exclusive dollar pricing of oil since the petrodollar agreements of the 1970s, chose not to formally renew that arrangement in June 2024. India and the UAE conducted the first crude oil transaction under a local currency settlement framework in August 2023. These are not ideological moves. They are rational portfolio decisions made by governments that have observed what happens when a country's central bank reserves are denominated in a currency that can be frozen by its issuer. The historical pattern here is worth stating precisely. Weaponization of the reserve currency does not immediately destroy it. The dollar remains dominant after 2022 in the same way sterling remained nominally important after 1956. But it changes the calculation for every foreign holder, and it accelerates the quiet repositioning that Warning Sign 2 describes. Warning Sign 4. A credible alternative emerges, even if imperfect. The fourth warning sign is the one most often misunderstood. People look for a replacement currency that is obviously superior to the incumbent. They do not find one, and they conclude that the incumbent is safe. This is the wrong analysis. Reserve currencies are not replaced because a better option appears. They are replaced when the incumbent's weaknesses accumulate to the point where an imperfect alternative becomes preferable to continued exposure to the incumbent. This is precisely what the historical record shows. The dollar did not replace sterling because the dollar was obviously and universally superior. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 was not a peaceful handover of reserve currency status. It was a negotiation in which the United States, representing 50% of global GDP at the moment of maximum American industrial dominance, effectively forced terms on an exhausted British delegation led by John Maynard Keynes. Keynes proposed an international reserve currency, the Bancor, that would not be controlled by any single nation. The United States rejected it. The dollar was installed as the anchor of the new system, not because it was the ideal solution, but because the United States held most of the world's gold, most of its industrial capacity, and most of its military power, and the exhausted nations of Europe needed American credit to rebuild. The pound sterling did not collapse the moment the dollar appeared as an alternative. The sterling area, a network of more than 30 countries that held their reserves in pounds and settled trade within the zone in sterling, persisted into the 1960s, more than 2 decades after Bretton Woods nominally established dollar dominance. The academic research has shown that sterling's continuing presence in global reserves during this period was maintained partly through coercion. British monetary authorities used a combination of capital market access and political pressure to prevent sterling area members from diversifying. As soon as countries gained the political independence to make their own reserve decisions, they diversified away from sterling immediately. The alternative to the dollar does not need to be obviously superior to begin attracting allocation. It needs to be sufficiently credible that the marginal holder prefers it to continued dollar exposure. In 2009, following the financial crisis, Zhou Xiaochuan, the governor of the People's Bank of China, published an essay calling for a new international reserve currency. He cited Triffin's dilemma directly and argued that the world needed a reserve currency disconnected from individual nations' economic interests. The essay was widely noted and widely dismissed. 14 years later, China and Brazil signed an agreement to conduct bilateral trade in their own currencies. The value of that bilateral trade is approximately $150 billion annually. The current alternative is not a single currency. It is a portfolio shift. Countries are not replacing dollars with yuan the way dollars replace sterling. They are replacing a portion of their dollar exposure with gold, which carries no credit risk, cannot be frozen, and is accepted everywhere, and with bilateral currency arrangements that allow trade settlement without dollar intermediation. This is a less dramatic alternative than the one people expect. But it does not need to be dramatic to be effective. The shift in the share of gold in emerging market central bank reserves from 4% a decade ago to 9% today does not sound like a revolution, but it represents a structural reallocation of reserve preferences that has no precedent in the post-Bretton Woods era. The World Bank, the IMF, and the Bank for International Settlements have all published analyses in the past 3 years acknowledging the dollar's declining share. The Federal Reserve itself has published research examining the relationship between central bank gold accumulation and reserve diversification. These institutions are not alarmist. They do not describe these trends as an imminent crisis, but they are documenting the pattern, and the pattern they are documenting is warning sign 4, what the forensic record says about the present moment. Now I want to be precise about what the historical evidence actually allows us to conclude, because the collapse of a reserve currency is a slow-moving event measured in decades, not in quarters. The common mistake is to observe the warning signs and conclude that the collapse is imminent. The common mistake on the other side is to observe that the collapse has not happened yet and conclude that the warning signs are not real. Neither conclusion is supported by the forensic record. The British pound did not collapse at Suez in 1956. It continued to serve as a reserve currency for more than a decade after that crisis. The dollar did not collapse in 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window. It survived, and it was actually strengthened in some ways by the transition to the petrodollar system. In the years that followed, reserve currencies are extraordinarily resilient because the network effects that sustain them are real. The world cannot switch to a new reserve currency overnight without disrupting enormous quantities of existing contracts, debt instruments, and trade relationships that are denominated in the incumbent currency. But resilience is not the same as permanence. What the forensic record shows is this. Every reserve currency that has exhibited all 4 warning signs simultaneously has eventually been displaced. Not immediately, not on any predictable timeline, but inevitably. The accumulation of all 4 signs creates a system that is structurally fragile, even if it appears superficially stable. The fragility builds until some event, sometimes a geopolitical shock, sometimes a financial crisis, sometimes a simple arithmetic tipping point, creates the visible break. The Roman denarius was still technically in circulation for ceremonial purposes in the early 300s AD, even though it contained almost no silver. The pound sterling was still used in international trade in the early 1970s, even though it had been devalued twice and the sterling area had effectively collapsed. The visible endpoint always comes later than the structural endpoint. The question the historical evidence forces us to ask about the present moment is not whether the dollar will be replaced. The historical evidence answers that question. Every reserve currency eventually is. The question is, what the position of an individual holder of dollar-denominated assets should be in a period when all 4 warning signs are present, and the timeline of displacement remains unknown. The historical evidence offers a precise answer to this question, and it is not about predicting the date of the break. The people who preserved their wealth through reserve currency transitions were not the people who correctly predicted when the transition would happen. They were the people who understood the structural fragility of the incumbent system and positioned themselves in assets that retain value regardless of which currency system emerged on the other side. In Rome, those who converted denarii to gold aurei before the final debasement preserved their wealth when the monetary economy partially collapsed and regions reverted to commodity barter. In Britain's sterling transition, the countries that converted sterling reserves to gold before 1956 came out whole. The countries that held sterling through the devaluation of 1967 absorbed a 14% loss on the face value of their holdings, plus decades of inflation. In the 1971 transition, Germany, which had begun rebuilding its gold reserves in the early 1960s and had partially converted dollar holdings before Nixon's announcement, was better positioned for the decade of dollar weakness that followed than the countries that continued to hold dollar reserves at the Bretton Woods parity. The pattern is not complicated. It is, in fact, exactly the same across 2,000 years of reserve currency transitions. The assets that retain value across reserve currency transitions share 3 characteristics. They are not promises. They are not dependent on the creditworthiness of any government, and they are not denominated in the currency that is undergoing stress. Gold is the clearest example in the historical record, but the broader category includes productive land commodities with intrinsic utility and equity stakes in enterprises that produce real things that people need, regardless of what currency those things are priced in. The most dangerous asset class in a reserve currency transition is sovereign debt denominated in the declining currency. The holders of Roman war bonds received 25 cents on the dollar during the post-Weimar revaluation in 1924. The holders of British government debt absorbed the 1967 devaluation and the 1970s inflation simultaneously. The holders of dollar-denominated assets in the 1970s experienced 10 years of currency debasement, severe enough that the real return on U.S. Treasuries was negative for most of the decade. In each case, the people who held the sovereign debt of the reserve currency issuer in the final decades of its dominance were the people who subsidized the transition costs for everyone else. One final number. I want to leave you with one number, because it is the number that sits at the intersection of all four warning signs. In 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, the U.S. federal debt held by the public was approximately $300 billion, representing about 25% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office's 2025 projections show that the U.S. federal debt held by the public has now exceeded 100% of GDP, and it is projected to reach 150% of GDP by 2040. Annual interest payments on that debt have crossed $1 trillion. The United States is currently paying more in interest on its debt than it spends on the entire defense budget. When Triffin testified before Congress in 1959, the number that alarmed him was the growing ratio of dollar claims to American gold reserves. He said it would eventually create a confidence crisis. He did not know when. But he said the math made the crisis certain. The question is not whether the math will eventually matter. It always does. It always has. The question is the same one that every holder of Roman war bonds, British sterling reserves, and dollar-denominated assets faced in their own time. Not when, but what to do while you wait. The next video in this series examines a question the comments on this video will generate. What did the people who correctly positioned themselves during the sterling transition in the 1960s actually hold? And how did they structure it? The answer is more specific and more actionable than you would expect.